The Stone Age could rightfully be called a dark chapter of our history, though considering that our species, Homo sapiens in its current form, has existed for roughly 200,000 years, those chapters are more like the scant 5,000 years of civilization that take up 99% of the content in textbooks. And that's without even touching on our more distant ancestors, the other members of the human genus who lived on this planet for millions of years. This enormous pre-civilization period, lacking written records, is typically called prehistoric. It's mainly studied by archaeologists and anthropologists. And if you think life back then was basically the same as now, just with a bunch of clueless cavemen running around in animal skins, you're way off. It was a completely different, harsh world that would absolutely shock the modern person. And today we're going to dive into why surviving in it was no small feat. Let's imagine a modern human miraculously time-traveled to the Stone Age, say 40,000 years ago, around the time our species began spreading across Europe. What dangers and challenges would they face? First, let's look at the modern human themselves. While they might be packed with theoretical knowledge, their physical condition leaves much to be desired. Running a couple of kilometers is a serious workout for most people. Thanks to smartphones and computers, many have vision problems. In developed countries, up to 60% of the population is nearsighted, and over 20% of young people deal with this issue. Our sense of smell has also dulled from disuse. And teeth? That's a sore subject for a lot of folks. Let's not forget the 20th century marked the era when humanity, or at least the more developed parts of it, practically conquered infant and child mortality. In the past, about 1 in 3 children didn't survive, which was a typical figure for most mammals. In other words, 1 in every 3 people alive today owes their life to modern medicine, even before factoring in how it saves us later in life. However, nature's harsh logic comes with a trade-off. By bypassing natural selection, we've ended up with more people living with chronic conditions, often thanks to pharmaceuticals and medical treatments. So even though a time-traveling human might be vaccinated against certain diseases, they wouldn't exactly be a health or endurance powerhouse by Stone Age standards. The Stone Age is often linked in people's minds with the Ice Age, which started several million years ago and technically is still ongoing. I can't stress enough that for most of Earth's history, there weren't any ice caps at the poles. Their presence is one of the defining traits of an ice age, the same ice age that in a way gave rise to us. The Ice Age itself, much like George Martin's Game of Thrones, can be divided into alternating long summers, called interglacial periods, lasting thousands to tens of thousands of years, and the typically longer, colder glacial periods. Some interglacials were even warmer than the current Holocene epoch, which we've been living in for roughly 12,000 years. We can partially reconstruct the climate of the past thanks to ancient pollen preserved in soil layers for tens of thousands of years. By analyzing the types of plants, we can figure out whether a region was tundra, coniferous, or deciduous forest, or dry steppe at a given time. During glacial periods, though massive ice sheets advanced far south, sometimes reaching as far as modern-day Dnipro in Ukraine, there was still some seasonality. Summers were shorter and cooler, but they did exist. On average, global temperatures during these glacial periods dropped by 5 to 7 degrees Celsius. Imagine if the climate of Krasnodar became like Moscow's, and Moscow's turned into what you'd find in Murmansk or Khanty-Mansiysk. That's essentially what it was like during the settlement of Europe, around 40 to 45,000 years ago, at the start of the Mologa-Shekshna interglacial period. While it was relatively warm by Ice Age standards, glaciers still covered the Novgorod region, and much of Central Europe was locked in permafrost. The northernmost known Upper Paleolithic settlement is Sungir, located in the Vladimir region. For the most part, our time-traveling modern human would find sparse forests, tundra steppes, and a much harsher climate than we're used to today. And their first challenge would be the cold. Of course, everything depends on the season, the time period, and the location. But in general, humans have limits to how much cold they can handle. Ancient people spent much of their lives outdoors in harsh climates. Take the example of Porfiry Ivanov, who demonstrated that humans can adapt to freezing temperatures, even spending hours in the cold without clothing. However, that level of adaptation takes a lot of time and effort, and isn't something everyone can achieve. For the average modern person without warm clothing, it only takes about 5 degrees Celsius for hypothermia to set in, and that's without wind or damp conditions, which are common in mountainous areas. In places where a Stone Age person would light a small fire, wrap themselves in a fur and get a good night's sleep, our modern human might not wake up at all, and cold isn't the only issue. Next up is the danger of becoming someone else's dinner. Alongside predators that still exist today, there were others that didn't make it to the present. Everyone knows about saber-toothed cats, but saber-tooth refers to a subfamily of felines with many species. In Eurasia, there were homotheriums, weighing about 200 kilograms, and cave lions, slightly larger than today's African lions, reaching up to 300 kilograms. And just to clarify, the term cave in cave lion or cave bear doesn't mean they exclusively lived in caves. Speaking of cave bears, they grew up to 3.5 meters long and weighed a whopping 900 kilograms. There's even evidence that Neanderthals might have had a bear cult. Bear skulls and bones have been found arranged in specific patterns at various sites, leading researchers to speculate that these could have been the first altars. So it's entirely possible that the first religion was centered around an extinct species of bear. Even the wolf we all know today was different back then, with a shorter muzzle and bigger teeth. But you didn't even need a predator to run into trouble. A woolly rhinoceros weighing over 3 tons or a giant deer with antlers spanning 4 meters could have been just as dangerous. And let's not forget mammoths. Who knows what their temperament was like? And then there are the bugs. Some studies have found parasites in preserved mammoth remains. I didn't dive too deep into that research, but I'd bet the insects that harassed the thick-skinned, woolly megafauna of the Pleistocene would be a nightmare for our modern time traveler. Even worse, though, could be the locals. It wouldn't matter if they were the indigenous Neanderthals or Homo sapiens who'd only recently arrived in Europe, around 40,000 years ago. By the way, Neanderthals were once thought to be our direct ancestors but are now seen as a separate branch, an alternative humanity, if you will. Either way, while ancient remains are rare, researchers have indirect evidence that both groups practiced cannibalism. This evidence typically includes cut marks on bones where muscles were attached and hollow bones cracked open for their marrow. Our ancestors didn't just eat Neanderthals, they ate each other too. Neanderthals, on the other hand, were likely even more aggressive in this respect. For example, remains found at the Krapina site in Croatia suggest that a family group of about 20 people, of various ages and sexes, ended up as someone's meal. There's also evidence of ritual killings. At Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, archaeologists discovered the simultaneous burial of 3 children, all with congenital abnormalities. Meanwhile, at Sungir, which we mentioned earlier, a wealthy burial of a man who was killed by a blow under the collarbone is accompanied by the graves of 2 children. Often it's hard to piece together what exactly happened, but it seems clear that ancient humans living in harsh climates and relying heavily on hunting weren't exactly pacifists. Organized warfare likely came later, with the advent of agricultural societies. Still, even without formal conflicts, running into an ancient human probably wouldn't end well for a time-traveling modern visitor. So, the plan to find people and seek salvation back in those distant times might not have worked out. True, the population density was minimal, so to encounter our distant ancestors on the glacial expanses, a modern-day person would probably have to trek several hundred kilometers. However, aside from the cold, predators, and potential run-ins with unfriendly locals, there was also the problem of finding food to deal with. Based on the diets of European Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens, it's clear the environment wasn't overflowing with edible plants, roots, or berries. Their diet was heavily meat-based, and hunting large herd animals like bison or wild horses was common. Hunting was dangerous and usually required teamwork. Neanderthal skeletons often show fractures similar to those seen in modern-day rodeo riders. Living with such frequent injuries was only possible because of the support of the group. Despite the horrors of cannibalism and other brutal behaviors, early humans also cared for the sick and injured. Without a group, our time traveler would be in real trouble. Making effective tools, hunting large animals that often outweighed humans many times over, and preserving meat, all while defending it from predators and scavengers with excellent senses of smell, would be nearly impossible alone. On top of that, modern humans have moved away from a predominantly meat-based diet. Eating mostly meat and fat every day would likely wreak havoc on our bodies. It's also worth noting that during the Ice Age, massive ice sheets covered parts of the continent, lowering sea levels and making the climate drier. Rivers were likely less full than they are today. Large animals mainly lived near glaciers, which melted in the summer, nourishing grassy vegetation that fed herbivores. The experience of a modern person dropped into the Stone Age could be summarized like this. Surrounded by a tundra or forest steppe environment, a colder and drier climate, and more wildlife, both predators and prey, than we see today. Wandering nearby are gangs of Neanderthal thugs whose intentions are unclear but likely not good. And then there are our direct ancestors, who might welcome you, or might not. For a group of hunters, a random modern human would probably seem like more of a burden than a benefit. Also, Stone Age people were fiercely tied to their traditions. Even the specific methods for chipping stone tools remained unchanged for millennia. So, if our time traveler were to introduce an advanced idea, like metalworking, it probably wouldn't catch on. All in all, the odds of surviving in that era look pretty slim to me. Of course, it all depends on the individual, their willpower, physical condition, skills, and most importantly, their luck.